is just for the Army. Because if we have crashes as early as 1945, that was Army Air Force. So they broke off into two branches, and God knows what the Air Force had that could have started back engineering way before the Army. But the thing is that it began to make sense because Corso testified twice in Italy. We brought him there on the condition that we bring his grandsons with him, because the reason why Corso even began to talk was because of his family, his children, his grandchildren. And I want to take this opportunity to say that there is a researcher in the field that has been bashing Corso and the ex-defense minister, Paul Hellyer, as being liars. And I think that is shameful, and I think karma has, what goes around comes around. When someone is no longer here with us, like a Corso that can't defend himself, I think that listening to a whole entire lecture on Colonel Corso or Paul Hellyer, or the fact that this cannot be true is not cool. And because Corso was telling the truth, and it made sense, and he was the first one. And at that time, I had people from major corporations that had taken the integrated circuit as a Army request. In other words, the Army had funded their research, come forth and talk to me, one from a major computer company. So I knew I was telling the truth, and it all made sense. That's one thing I wanted to share with you, because the back engineering started way back when, not just in Corso's time. I mean, that's what they're interested in, is the toys. And number two, you mentioned the type of alien, and my research in Italy, not in the United States, shows that the contacts who were made there from the Billy Meyer case on, the Pescara case 1957, Maurizio Cavallo, were human-type aliens. They were people. They were taller than the average person. They had telepathic abilities. They had all kinds of different abilities that probably we have, but they were people. So in my judgment and in my career, I had to shift gears from this ridiculous image of a gray whatever, which is a robotic, type of being, to the fact that we have people visiting us.
Right, and they're intelligent, conscious beings that have developed what we have innately, and that's the ability to have telepathy and remote viewing and higher states of consciousness, which is precisely what CSETI.org, CSETI.org is using in our contact protocols. And we've been ridiculed a great deal for stepping into that. And yet when I talk to someone like Dr. Sue Woolsey, who is the Chief Operating Officer of the National Academy of Sciences, and she and I start talking about how these civilizations are communicating across the vastness of space, since we now know they're here, I immediately start talking about transdimensional technologies that interface with coherent thought, just like light can be coordinated so that the wavelengths link up into what we call a laser, where it's coherent light. The same thing can happen with thought, and there are electromagnetic systems that interface with this kind of coherent thought, which is what CSETI, what I train people to do. And this is something not understood. People just dismiss it and laugh at it, but it's actually these experiences that people who've had contact have had is opening the door to an entirely new multidimensional reality and physics and science and even spirituality that is just being pushed aside. And what's being promoted, in my opinion, is the false stuff. And I know that Corso, it's interesting because I personally know the Honorable Paul Hellyer, who had been the Minister of Defense for Canada. And, in fact, I met with him very recently here in Washington, D.C., and I was meeting with him with one of the top 14, quote, national treasures in the scientific community in the Department of Defense, who's on our team. And Mr. Hellyer and I and some other people were meeting with this scientist to talk about these technologies. And what I found him as I've gotten to know people like Mr. Hellyer is that he's a very dignified and brilliant man who understands the implications of this, the macroeconomic and societal and cultural implications. And he told me personally that he, because he had some contacts in America from when he had been Minister of Defense, that he had asked a general that he knew if this information in Colonel Corso's book, The Day After Roswell, was true. And the general turned to him and said, yes, that and more, and confirmed it. And he knew this man was completely not lying. He was not relying just on what Colonel Corso wrote. Now, I have to say, just in terms of the attacks that Colonel Corso has gotten, part of the problem is that there were people when he was putting that book together who got involved in that project, and I don't want to talk about names, but these are people who are tied into the shadowy interface between the intelligence community and the UFO retail subculture, who were involved in writing and editing that book, who deliberately altered things in a way that put in some factual errors which could be fact-checked and found to be untrue. And Colonel Corso trusted these people to do that. Now, when I was meeting with Colonel Corso's son, he went through this in a great deal of detail. I was at their home. And I said, yes, this is done very commonly, because if you aren't careful, then someone like Colonel Corso, who was getting up there in years, I think he was in his 80s, it's one of these things where they rush that, and then there were things embedded in it, and the term that's used at the National Security Agency. I have a man who spent many years as the right-hand assistant to the director of the National Security Agency, who this man is on my team. He's my document authenticator, by the way. And he said, oh, yes, we have a term for that, DDT. I said, DDT, what does that mean? He says, well, you set up a distraction and a decoy, and then you put false information in it so it trashes it. So you can take a very good case or a very good thing, and you can put just enough stuff in it so that it eventually gets trashed and pulls anyone down with it. And he says this is done all the time on the UFO subject, and it's done very, very carefully. And this is why UFO researchers have to be so assiduous and so careful, because you're dealing with folks who will stop at almost nothing to try to distort the truth on this issue, to infiltrate and to twist it. I mean, I remind people of the Wilbur Smith document from 1951, when this top secret memo that was accidentally declassified in the 70s, it turns out, where he basically said that the flying saucers are real, that a team headed up by Dr. Vannevar Bush, who headed up the Manhattan Project for the atomic bomb, was looking into it, that they were studying, quote, the modus operandi of these spacecraft, meaning how they operate, what the physics and science was, and, this is the shocker, that the whole matter was more secret than the development of the hydrogen bomb. Now, remember that in 1951, we had not detonated the first hydrogen bomb. That was at Bikini Atoll in 1952. And so here we have a top-secret document confirming all of this. It's not contested. There's nothing controversial about it. So if now we're talking 60 years ago, this is 2011, that this level of secrecy surrounded the subject, imagine the kinds of chicanery and nonsense that goes on to alter the message, change cases, and change how the public perceives it. It's been very, very well done. A lot of people don't realize how skilled the keepers of the secrecy are. And unfortunately, Colonel Corso fell victim to some of these DDT tricks as he told his story and as that went to press. And that's part of what happens. And then, of course, there are people who are on the payroll who just go around and debunk and attack people who are doing good work. I mean, I've been called everything in the book, and I really don't care, because I'm not running for mayor of Crazy Town UFO community at all. I could care less. My point is that people have to understand, if you step into this issue and you start unveiling real information, particularly information that runs counter to the messaging and agenda of the secret government group that's been keeping this secret, then they're going to do everything they have to either defame you, to debunk you, to put poison pills into the evidence, to do whatever they can. And this is a very typical story of what happened to poor Colonel Corso.
Yes, I realized that, and his son had told me the same thing too. And yep. we need to remember that there was a ghostwriter or a co-writer for that book. I'm going to say that much. that
Yes.
that Sforza was of great interest to a lot of people, especially the intelligence community, because he was coming out with what you're talking about today, which is the real reason for the secrecy. None of us could figure it out before. I didn't figure it out before 1997. I didn't know what it was or why we couldn't talk about it.
Well, I had figured this out in 1992 and 93, and it was interesting because when I was asked to put the briefings together for President Clinton, this was a central part of what we were talking about. And yet the irony here, and this is a delicious little bit of irony, I don't know if I've ever shared this with you, Paula. This is recounted in not as much detail or in my book, Hidden Truth, Forbidden Knowledge, which people can get at disclosureproject.org. But I was invited out to the Rockefeller Ranch, and Lawrence Rockefeller was very much supportive of disclosure, and also even more so of what CSETI was doing with contact. A lot of people don't realize that. And Lawrence is, God bless his soul, he's passed away. Lawrence and Mary, his wife, hosted us, and of course they hosted Bill and Hillary Clinton there at the Rockefeller Ranch so that they could go through the briefing materials that we had put together and sort of the best available evidence cases that I had initiated and started putting together for the president. But what was interesting is that one night Lawrence Rockefeller pulled me aside, and we went out on this deck there, and they have a ranch in the Tetons called the JY Ranch, and we went out there, and we were by this beautiful, I think it was an original Remington statue with a Native American on horseback with his headdress on and his arms outstretched to the stars, and it's crystal clear, and we're up there at this beautiful place in the Grand Tetons, which is just gorgeous. And Lawrence Rockefeller says, "When are you going to get this done?" And he's referring to getting disclosure and ending the secrecy. I said, "Lawrence, I'm just a country doctor. I'm an emergency doctor in North Carolina. And he says, I said, "We need you to step forward because you're a Rockefeller." He says, "Oh, no, I can't." And I said, "Lawrence, you're old, you're rich, and you're a Rockefeller. Anyone who knows me knows how direct I can be." And he looked at me, he kind of smiled. He says, "Yes, but I have family already jumping up and down on my, I won't say on what, on my toes, because I'm doing this much." And I said, "Really?" I said, "Just because you're hosting the president and me and these people?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, why?" He says, "Because they have interests that they feel would be hurt," and they're talking about financial interests. Now, it's interesting because his brother was David Rockefeller of Chase Manhattan Bank, which is now, whatever, Morgan Stanley, Chase, whatever conglomeration it is, I don't know. But, what was interesting about it is that, and of course his nephew, Jay, who had been chairman of the Intelligence Committee of the Senate, is from a coal state, West Virginia, where, obviously if this technology came out, we wouldn't need coal, and we certainly wouldn't be involved with the petrodollar, and it would be a totally new macroeconomic system. And so Lawrence there, here he is, this 80, I guess he was about 85 at the time, very wealthy man, had been everywhere. But he was very clear that, blood is thicker than water. And he was being very clear to me that he couldn't do it. And I said, well, Lawrence, what are we going to do? He says, "Well, you can do it." Now, remember, this is in the September of 1993. And I said, "Well, Lawrence, I'm just, I'm doing this in my spare time. I'm working full-time as an emergency doctor with 4 young daughters." And he said, "Well, it's like a flock of geese that form an arrow and are going through the air. You need to be here at the top end, and I'll be way back here in the back." I said, "Okay, you want me up here at the front taking all the headwinds?" I said, "That goose gets tired after a while." And we started laughing. But it was this very, everyone puts their pants on one leg at a time is what I tell people. And these things become, it's really interesting because when you're with folks like this, you realize that there are pressures, and some of them are financial, but some of them are familial, and then there are others. There are threats that are made and what have you. But there are a lot of ways that the secrecy kind of takes on a life of its own, and in that sort of inertia and the momentum that builds up around the secrecy, we have to have a group of people, the public mainly, that's why I'm talking about this on the World Fusion Network, who are enlightened, who understand the consciousness of the future, and who move this subject into the light and into a positive outcome.